The Battle of Saipan revealed both the devastating costs and the decisive gains of modern industrial warfare in a single campaign. Over 25 days, tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, with Japanese defenders making desperate sacrifices against impossible odds, their courage ultimately powerless before mechanized firepower. Entire defensive systems, built painstakingly over 18 months, crumbled within hours under the precision of Sherman tanks, exposing the futility of relying solely on fighting spirit and traditional military values. For Japan, the loss meant not only the destruction of its best-trained troops and armored units on the island, but also the exposure of its homeland to direct attack, as captured airfields brought B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. For the United States, the benefits were profound. The campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of industrial mass production, global logistics, and mechanized warfare, securing forward bases that enabled the strategic bombing campaign culminating in Japan's surrender. While the battle inflicted immense human suffering, it also marked a turning point that redefined warfare itself, proving that industrial capacity and technological reliability, more than sheer bravery, would decide the outcome of modern conflicts. June 15, 1944. Saipan Island, Northern Marana Islands, Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Goto pressed his binoculars to the narrow observation slit of his reinforced bunker. Beneath him, Saipan's shoreline lay outstretched like a pale ribbon against the emerald of the Pacific. For 18 months, his engineers had carved a fortress out of paradise. Concrete pillboxes speckled the sand. Artillery dominated every ridge, and tank obstacles scarred the likely landing beaches. "Sir," his aide murmured, pointing to the horizon. "The American fleet." Goto refocused his lenses and stared at a sight beyond belief. More than 800 vessels blotting the line where sea met sky, the largest invasion armada yet seen in the Pacific. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and swarms of landing craft turning. The water a gunmetal gray. As he zoomed in on the LST decks, his stomach tightened. Blocky, massive shapes sat on board. Not the light M3 Stuart tanks they'd contended with at Guadalcanal, but hulking 31-ton machines with heavy armor and 75mm guns. The M4 Sherman, in unprecedented numbers, had arrived in the Central Pacific. What the Japanese defenders failed to grasp was that these armored giants would upend everything they assumed about island fighting, changing the tactical map of the Pacific forever. A new era of American armored superiority in amphibious assaults was beginning, with disastrous implications for Japan's defensive plans. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's assassination in April 1943 had shattered Japan's naval leadership, yet the empire's defensive doctrine remained stubbornly the same. Islands would be turned into slaughterhouses. The hope was that every shore would cost the Americans so dearly that they would choose negotiation over a continued push toward the Japanese home islands. The Mariana Group stood as the decisive trial of that belief. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam made up Japan's inner defensive ring, part of the absolute national defense zone declared in September 1943. Should those islands fall, American B-29 superfortresses would be within range of Tokyo. The psychological blow would be immense. For the first time, ordinary Japanese would confront the reality of strategic bombing on their own soil. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saitito had 32,000 troops under his command on Saipan. 18 months of relentless construction, using Korean, forced labor and Japanese crews, had produced concrete emplacements with walls up to 4 ft thick at every likely landing site. Artillery positions overlapped fields of fire. Tank traps and barriers funneled attackers into chosen kill zones where hidden anti-tank guns waited. Japan's high command believed these works were impregnable. In previous Pacific fights, light, American tanks had proven unable to break reinforced concrete, and infantry assaults choked under concentrated fire from mutually supporting positions. Tarawa, in November 1943, had demonstrated how grievous American losses could become when attacking prepared fortifications. But Sherman's arriving in company strength introduced a variable the Japanese had not encountered at scale: intelligence. From Tarawa had reported only a few medium tanks, most of them lost amid the chaos of the landing. Saipan would see over 150 M4 Shermans employed in coordinated combined arms attacks. For the Americans, Saipan signified more than new bases for strategic bombing. It was proof that American industry could project decisive force across 6,000 mi of ocean. The Sherman, mass-produced in numbers that dwarfed Japan's manufacturing, would be the hammer that shattered Japanese defenses throughout the Central Pacific. The strategic picture was vast. As the Saipan assault began, the Pacific Fleet was poised to fight the decisive clash in the Philippine Sea, a battle that would wreck Japanese carrier aviation. Admiral Raymond Spruant led Task Force 58, the most powerful naval concentration in history, boasting 15 aircraft carriers and 956 planes. Naval dominance paired with armored ground forces would display American capabilities Japan could not match. Moving a 31-ton Sherman from an American factory to a Pacific shoreline posed near insurmountable logistical puzzles. Each M4A2 Sherman needed special transport aboard landing ship tanks, ungainly vessels 328 ft long that could carry only 14 tanks per trip across some 4,000 mi of hostile ocean. The arithmetic was brutal. A single Sherman burned roughly 50 gallons of diesel per hour under sustained combat. In tropical conditions with electrical systems running continuously, consumption climbed to 60 gall per hour. Pacific atolls had almost no infrastructure. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery round, every spare part had to be shipped across vast seas along supply lines constantly threatened by submarines. Ammunition calculations alone were staggering. The Sherman's 75mm M3L40 fired high explosive rounds weighing about 15 lb and armor-piercing projectiles listed at 18s. Standard combat load was 90 main gun rounds per tank, so a company of 15 Shermans required $24,000 worth of main gun ammunition. Machine gun belts for the coaxial 30 and hull-mounted 50 added roughly $15,000 more per company. Mechanical dependability was a matter of life and death. A snapped track or a ruined transmission. $6,000 MER from American factories turned a Sherman into a 31-ton paperweight. Tropical climates chewed through rubber seals in weeks. Salt air corroded electrical systems faster than crews could mend them. Humidity jammed moving parts. Spare components could take months to arrive, if supply ships avoided enemy submarines. Island terrain posed its own engineering headaches. Fine volcanic dust, harder than sand, clogged air filters in hours. Razor-sharp grit shredded rubber track pads built for European soils. Many beaches had gradients beyond a Sherman's climbing ability, forcing engineers to build passable routes inland with special equipment. Japanese defenses had planned for nearly every American threat, except the concentrated protection and firepower of medium tanks operating in company-sized units. Their Type 1 47mm anti-tank guns had been intended to stop Soviet-era light tanks or captured Chinese vehicles. Concrete bunkers could resist indirect bombardment, but had never been tested against direct hits from 75mm tank guns inside 200 YD. The waterproofing challenge pushed engineering to its limits. Shermans had to ford water up to 54 in deep without drowning engines or frying electrical systems. Every seam and hatch required sealing compounds. Air intakes needed extension tubes that could be jettisoned once the vehicle reached dry ground. Crews drilled emergency procedures to escape from submerged tanks. Supply chain math exposed the scale of America's industrial commitment. Building one Sherman took roughly 2,000 man-hours. Keeping a tank company in action for 30 days meant about 40 LST voyages carrying fuel, shells, spare parts, and replacement vehicles. The logistics story for armored warfare stretched back to steel mills in Pittsburgh, rubber plantations in Liberia, and oil refineries in Texas. First Lieutenant Edward James Bale led Company C, I Marine Amphibious Corps Tank Battalion, the first Marine medium tank unit sent to the Central Pacific. Born in Detroit in 1918, Bale had been a production supervisor at the River Rouge plant before enlisting after Pearl Harbor. At 26, he combined a practical feel for machinery with natural leadership, qualities suited to commanding complex armored operations. 18 months of training in New Zealand and Australia had proven his technical skill. While other units struggled to keep tanks running in the tropics, Bale's company sustained 97% operational readiness through rigorous preventive maintenance and crew discipline. He personally oversaw waterproofing modifications on each of his 15 M4A2 Shermans so their engines would survive amphibious landings. His unit comprised 3 platoons of 5 tanks apiece. Each Sherman carried 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, who also manned the hull machine gun. These crews had trained together for over a year, forging the mechanical coordination vital to surviving armored combat. Sergeant Robert Morrison led the tip-of-the-spear Sherman, christened Colorado. Born in 1920 in Highland Park, Michigan, Morrison had worked on Ford's assembly line before enlisting in the Marine Corps in early 1942. His deep familiarity with internal combustion engines and mechanical systems had made him the company's unofficial maintenance authority, and Morrison knew every part of his tank's General Motors 6046 twin diesel power plants, whose synchronized operation produced 410 horsepower. His crew typified American tank personnel, working-class men with mechanical know-how and a fierce desire to prove themselves in combat. Corporal James Johnson, a former machinist from Cleveland, served as gunner and could place 75mm rounds with remarkable precision. Private First Class Anthony Romano, the son of a Pittsburgh steelworker, was the loader whose physical strength kept ammunition moving rapidly during sustained fights. Technical Sergeant Harold Nakamura acted as the battalion's intelligence specialist and liaison to the Nisei interpreters from the Military Intelligence Service. Born in California's Central Valley to immigrant parents, Nakamura had studied engineering at the University of California before the war, and his analysis of Japanese fortification methods, based on captured documents and prisoner interrogations, would prove crucial in devising coordinated tank infantry tactics against prepared positions. Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Goto, commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 118th Infantry Regiment, was responsible for defending Saipan's southern beaches, where American intelligence expected the main landing. A 1933 graduate of the Imperial War College, Goto had spent 2 years with German units in the mid-1930s studying fortification engineering and observing construction of the Siegfried Line, and having served as a military attaché in Washington from 1937 to 1939, he understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese officers. His intelligence estimates correctly predicted the invasion's size and composition, but he underestimated the psychological and tactical shock that mass Sherman operations would inflict on fixed defenses. His defensive sector contained a dozen reinforced concrete bunkers with 4-foot-thick walls and roofs built to resist direct hits from 8-inch naval guns. Interconnected tunnels allowed movement between positions without exposing troops on the surface, and pre-registered artillery emplacements provided overlapping fields of fire for every likely landing area. Captain Hiroshi Yamada commanded elements of the 9th Tank Regiment on Saipan, with 34 operational vehicles from his original complement, 23 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, and 11 Type 95 Heigo light tanks, Japan's most modern armored assets in the Pacific. The Chiha weighed about 15 tons and carried 47mm guns, while the Hago weighed roughly 7 tons with 37mm armament. Yamada was realistic about his tank's limits. Japanese armor doctrine favored speed and maneuver over protection, appropriate for fighting in China or supporting infantry against poorly equipped opponents. But against Shermans with superior armor, firepower, and mechanical reliability, his vehicles would be badly outclassed in direct engagements. His crews averaged about 3 years' experience, mostly gained during the Second Sino-Japanese War. They were adept at infantry support and well acquainted with their machines, yet none had faced enemy armor comparable to the Sherman, and their training emphasized resolve and sacrifice rather than tactical withdrawal in the face of overwhelming force. Colonel Takuzo Ieta commanded the artillery regiment supporting Saipan's defense, including 12 Type 147mm anti-tank guns sighted to cover probable tank approaches. These guns could penetrate a Sherman's side or rear armor inside roughly 500 yards, but were ineffective against frontal armor, except at extremely close range. Ieta's crews were disciplined and competent, but their equipment proved inadequate for the threat. By mid-1944, American intelligence for Operation Forager, the Mariana Invasion, had reached unprecedented sophistication. Submarine reconnaissance photographed beach gradients and obstacles with startling precision, while high-altitude B-24 Liberators fitted with special cameras mapped Japanese defensive positions from 30,000 feet, pinpointing gun emplacements and bunkers. Major General Howland Mad Smith, commander of V Amphibious Corps, studied those aerial photographs with magnifiers for weeks, aware that Shermans could change Pacific warfare if they could reach the shore intact and operational. Pre-landing bombardment therefore had to neutralize coastal guns capable of destroying landing ships before they could unload, and the plan called for an unparalleled concentration of firepower: 7 battleships, 11 cruisers, and 26 destroyers would send roughly 15,000 tons of shells onto Saipan's beaches and defensive works over 3 days, with carrier aircraft adding about 800 tons of bombs and rockets. The aim was not only to destroy positions, but to gouge shell craters that would offer cover for advancing infantry and tanks. Waterproofing. The tanks demanded engineering innovations at an unprecedented scale. Marine engineers developed sealing compounds able to withstand saltwater immersion for up to 6 hours while preserving engine and electrical integrity, and air intakes were fitted with extendable snorkels to permit operation in water deeper than 5 feet. Every potential water entry, engine compartments, transmission housings, electrical panels, ammunition stowage, and crew spaces required rubber gaskets, waterproof seals, and special drainage systems so water could be expelled once dry ground was reached, and crews drilled escape procedures for partially submerged vehicles. Fuel planning consumed months of meticulous calculation. Each Sherman carried about 150 gallons of diesel in internal tanks, plus external stores for extended missions, and under tropical conditions with electrical systems running continuously. Combat consumption averaged roughly 60 gallons per hour, necessitating refueling every 5 to 6 hours. Fuel support therefore required specialized equipment, portable pumps, flexible hoses, jerry cans, and fuel testing gear prepositioned on the beaches as soon as landing zones were secured, with storage areas camouflaged from air observation and protected from artillery. Ammunition handling demanded industrial-scale organization. Each Sherman carried 90 main gun rounds, approximately 50 high-explosive shells for bunker and infantry suppression, 25 armor-piercing rounds for anti-tank use, and 15 smoke rounds for concealment and marking, and about 9,600 rounds of machine gun ammunition per tank, split evenly between the coaxial 30 and the hull-mounted 50. Maintenance preparations required full mobile repair facilities. Each tank company included organic maintenance sections with track repair tools, engine diagnostic equipment, welding, apparatus, and extensive spare parts, inventories, because combat had shown mechanical reliability to be as decisive as firepower. The Japanese had prepared for many contingencies, but not for the scale and sophistication of American armored operations. Their intelligence predicted 50-60 tanks, mostly light vehicles for infantry support, whereas the reality would be more than 150 Shermans employed in coordinated combined arms teams with dedicated infantry, artillery, and engineer support. Japanese anti-tank doctrine reflected lessons from border clashes with Soviet armor in the late 1930s. Type 147mm guns had worked against Light 26 and BT series tanks but were marginal against Sherman's frontal protection, effective only at extremely close range with perfect aim. Mining was Japan's most promising anti-tank option. Extensive minefields of anti-tank and anti-personnel devices covered likely approaches, but steel shortages forced many mines to use ceramic or concrete, casings that were less reliable than metal designs. At dawn on June 14, 1944, the troop ship Xylan rose and fell in pre-dawn swells 15 miles off Saipan, while Sergeant Morrison supervised final checks on Colorado and the other company's Sea Shermans on the tank deck. Engine oil topped up to maximum, track tension set to factory specifications, main guns bore-sighted with precision optics, and radios tested and confirmed on all command nets. Lieutenant Bale called over the rumble of engines with a blunt reminder about waterproofing procedures. "Keep those twin diesels running until you're well clear of the waterline," he warned, "because if the power plants quit in 5 feet of surf, they'll all be swimming home to California." The Sherman's General Motors 6046 twin diesel engines rumbled with dependable power, their synchronized units delivering 410 horsepower through controlled differential steering to tracks that could move 31 tons at about 26 mph on roads and 15 mph cross-country. The drivetrain had been proven in thousands of tanks, but not under Pacific amphibious combat conditions. Loading ammunition in cramped fighting compartments required precise choreography, high-explosive shells in ready racks nearest the main, gun, armor-piercing rounds stowed in floor bins beneath the turret, and machine gun belts packed into every remaining space not used for crew gear. Personal equipment was limited to essentials, medical kits, emergency rations, and individual weapons, and final inspections covered every vital system, with periscopes cleaned and aligned for optimal visibility and radio equipment tested on all frequencies with backup crystals at the ready. Fire suppression equipment was topped off and ready, and crews had practiced underwater bailout drills in case tanks flooded. Roles inside each vehicle reflected months of synchronized training. Morrison sat on the turret's right as commander, responsible for battlefield choices and picking targets. Corporal Johnson manned the 75mm gun and the coaxial machine gun from the left side. Private First Class Anthony Romano handled the ammunition and helped with aiming. Driver Private First Class Michael O'Brien of Boston managed the hull controls, linking transmission and steering through mechanical connections. Assistant Driver Private Thomas Anderson of Minnesota operated the hull-mounted machine gun and aided in lookout and navigation. Lieutenant Colonel Goto methodically reviewed his defense plan over detailed sand table models that replicated every contour of his sector. Coastal batteries would engage approaching landing vessels at maximum ranges, prioritizing the biggest ships that carried armor and heavy gear, while beach obstructions would funnel survivors into pre-selected kill zones where anti-tank crews and infantry weapons could be most effective. "All units confirm final readiness," his communications sergeant reported. "Artillery positions at full ammunition. Anti-tank crews have completed range cards for all likely approaches. Observation posts manned and reporting normal." Goto acknowledged the report while privately weighing the odds. Fresh intelligence indicated American tank strength far above prior estimates. More than 100 medium tanks backed by inexhaustible naval and artillery fire presented a problem beyond Japan's defensive capacity, but duty required them to resist with everything available. Japanese defensive theory stressed depth and interlocking support. Forward beach defenses would slow and disorganize assault waves while inflicting heavy losses. Secondary inland positions would create concentrated killing zones to destroy enemy armor with concealed guns, and rear lines would protect vital points for last-ditch resistance. Captain Yamada made final checks on his dispersed tank revetments, his 34 operational vehicles hidden along likely American avenues of advance. The Type 97 Chiha medium tanks mounted 47mm guns capable of penetrating a Sherman's side armor only at shorter ranges, and the lighter Type 95 Hago tanks were intended for infantry support and disrupting enemy supply routes. Addressing his crews, he spoke of honor and terrain advantage, urging them to rely on fighting spirit and local knowledge to overcome the enemy's numerical and material edge. The reality, however, was harsher. Japanese armor was configured for speed and close infantry support against lightly equipped foes, not for slugging with heavily armored Shermans that outclassed them in protection, firepower, and mechanical dependability. His men averaged roughly 3 years' service, experienced in China and infantry support missions, but none had faced medium American tanks on anything like the scale coming at Saipan. Colonel Ikeda's anti-tank positions offered Japan's best hope against armored assaults. A dozen Type 1 47mm guns sited in concealed bunkers with clear fields of fire aimed at expected approaches. Those guns needed near-perfect shot placement to pierce Sherman weak points and could only threaten side or rear armor at close ranges. Against frontal armor, they were essentially ineffective except in extremis. Mine warfare formed another key element of the defense. Extensive minefields were laid in likely approaches, but wartime shortages forced many mines to be built with ceramic or concrete casings rather than steel, reducing their reliability and overall effectiveness. Before dawn on June 15th, the pre-landing bombardment began, concentrating the industrial might of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers on the small island. Battleships Pennsylvania, California, Tennessee, and Maryland opened their 16-inch batteries, launching armor-piercing projectiles weighing thousands of pounds. The roar carried for miles, a sustained thunder that shook metal and marrow even 15 miles offshore. Colorado sat in LST-317's flooded well deck with twin diesels idling at 800 RPM as Sergeant Morrison peered through his periscope to watch explosions rip the beaches into volcanic upheavals, each heavy shell gouging crater after crater, tossing earth and timber hundreds of yards. "They're turning the whole damn island into dust," the loader muttered over the intercom, but Morrison knew what the men could not see from the tank deck. Many concrete emplacements had been engineered to survive everything short of a direct hit from the heaviest naval guns, and much of the fortification system would remain capable of exacting slaughter against landing forces. "Prepare to launch landing craft," the LST public address announced, as ballast tanks flooded and the sterns sank, letting ocean water into the tank deck. Morrison engaged Colorado's transmission and prepared his crew for the riskiest phase. Lieutenant Bale's portable radio crackled a final order about waterproofing. "Keep those twin diesels running until you're clear of the surf," he warned, "because if the engines quit in 5 feet of water, they'd all be swimming back to California." The Sherman's General Motors, 6046 twin diesels thrummed confidently, their synchronized units producing 410 horsepower delivered through controlled differential steering to tracks that could push 31 tons at about 26 mph on roads and 15 mph cross-country. Drivetrains proven in thousands of vehicles but not yet stressed in Pacific amphibious combat. Morrison eased Colorado down the bow ramp into roughly 5 feet of water. Warm seawater lapped the hull, but the waterproofing held and the diesels kept turning. Smoke and bombardment haze partly obscured the shoreline some 900 yards ahead, but Japanese coastal guns that had survived the barrage now opened. With lethal accuracy, 120mm shells blossomed around approaching craft like geysers, and LST-298 was struck amidships and erupted in flames, taking its 4 Shermans out of action before they ever reached shore. Morrison watched tracers and machine gun fire stitch through the air as infantrymen in the surf hugged the sand under murderous crossfire. He kept a steady advance, while his driver monitored engine temperature and oil pressure. At the high water line, Colorado came to where sand met jungle and Morrison's periscope fixed on the first defensive position. A reinforced concrete bunker, with 4-foot-thick walls and a 75mm gun covering the beach approach. Lieutenant Bale's voice ordered Colorado to eliminate that emplacement so the infantry could move inland, advising high-explosive rounds to maximize effect against concrete. Morrison trained the turret, centered the gun on the firing port, and prepared for rapid fire. At 250 yards against a stationary target, the shot would be precise. The crucial question hung in the air. Could he rounds penetrate reinforced concrete designed to shrug off naval bombardment? The first 15-pound high-explosive shell screamed out of the M3 gun, the Sherman rocking on its suspension as the round crossed the short distance and slammed into the bunker's port with devastating force. The outcome stunned everyone watching. The concrete emplacement, built to resist indirect ship fire, could not withstand direct hits from a tank gun at point-blank range. The shell punched through and detonated within, wiping out the gun crew and destroying the 75mm weapon. "We blew that thing wide open," the loader cried over the intercom, but Morrison was already scanning for the next threat. 2 more bunkers dominated the beach with interlocking small arms fire, and until they were neutralized, the Marines ashore remained pinned and unable to advance without armored support. The psychological blow to the defenders was immediate. From his command post, 600 yards inland, Lieutenant Colonel Goto watched in disbelief as carefully prepared coastal defenses, concrete emplacements meant to shrug off battleship shells, fell to direct tank fire at ranges where accuracy was assured. Radios across the defensive net buzzed with alarmed reports. American heavy tanks are destroying our positions with direct fire. Tokyo's military headquarters was stunned by radio traffic that smashed every core assumption about island defense. American tanks were not merely arriving on Pacific shores intact, but were methodically wrecking fortifications that had taken a year and a half to build. Reports reaching the capital described a defense network in real time unraveling as armored columns punched holes through positions. Emperor Hirohito was briefed on capabilities that exceeded previous conceptions of modern warfare. If 31-ton vehicles could be shipped 6,000 miles and employed effectively in amphibious assaults, what else could American industry deliver? The stakes reached beyond the battlefield. Saipan's airfields would put B-29 superfortresses within range of the home islands, meaning American industrial output could translate into strategic bombing of Japan itself, while Tokyo lacked the ability to sever those long supply lines. At dawn on June 17th, Captain Yamada led 30 tanks out of the pre-dawn gloom toward U.S. defenses around Aslito Airfield, fully aware most crews would die in the coming hour. His Type 97 Chiha tanks kept formation with 47mm armor-piercing rounds that simply could not defeat Sherman frontal armor. These vehicles embodied not only weapons, but men who advanced because duty demanded sacrifice, not because success was likely. Sergeant Morrison peered through Colorado's command periscope and, with professional sorrow, watched the approaching Japanese line look small and thin-skinned against American firepower. At 1,000 yards, he identified a target and ordered fire. The Sherman's armor-piercing round crossed the distance in a heartbeat, shattered the Chiha's inadequate plating, and detonated the vehicle's stores in a catastrophic fireball, killing Captain Yamada and his crew and silencing their command net. With leadership gone, the remaining Japanese tanks pressed on under standing orders and became excellent, exposed targets for American gunners trained in precision shooting. What followed was almost surgical destruction rather than a balanced, armored duel. Colorado knocked out 5 enemy tanks, China Gal 4, and Cecilia and Angel accounted for more, and by broad daylight, 28 Japanese tanks burned across Aslito. Only 2 limp Chihas escaped, abandoned by crews who preferred flight to certain death. American crews reported the outcome professionally and without triumphalism. Japanese tankers had shown extraordinary courage advancing against hopeless odds, and their sacrifice earned grudging respect. But the cost to Japan was irreparable. The loss of trained crews and irreplaceable vehicles eliminated Saipan's only mobile counterattack reserve. Lieutenant Bale filed a meticulous after-action report that noted enemy bravery, even as it confirmed unambiguous technological and operational superiority in armor protection, gunnery, crew training, mechanical dependability, and doctrine. 4. Defenders who hoped static positions could bleed attackers to the point of political withdrawal, the result was catastrophic. Infantry in fixed emplacements could delay, but not stop combined arms American teams backed by boundless logistics. Word of the armored collapse sent seismic shockwaves through Imperial headquarters. Intelligence described Sherman's systematically punching through supposedly invulnerable concrete works, and Emperor Hirohito and top ministers confronted a strategic reality they could not conceal from the public. If heavy tanks could be projected and sustained across oceanic distances with reliable maintenance, fuel, and ammo, Japan's calculations about making invasion prohibitively costly were nullified. Prime Minister and War Minister General Hideki Tojo faced facts that undermined every foundational premise of Japan's defensive strategy. Island fortifications no longer guaranteed prohibitive casualties for attackers. Saipan's fall placed Tokyo within the reach of B-29s and symbolized a larger truth. American industry could produce and ship overwhelming quantities of materiel while preserving the logistics to keep them fighting. Concurrently, the Pacific's other great clash, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, shattered Japanese carrier aviation in the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and Task Force 58 crippled Japan's ability to conduct offensive naval air operations. Japan lacked both the time and industrial bandwidth to redesign effective anti-tank weapons. Their 47mm guns, proven against light Soviet tanks, were impotent against Sherman frontal armor, and developing meaningful replacements would have conflicted with priorities for aircraft and naval construction needed for homeland defense. The strategic bombing implications were immediate and terrifying for Tokyo. B-29s based on Saipan could reach every major city and industrial center, enabling area bombing that Japanese air defenses could scarcely prevent. Planners soon recognized Saipan as the linchpin that made the devastating bomber campaign, and ultimately the atomic attacks that followed, possible by securing forward bases through armored and combined arms operations. Politically, the effects were swift. Tojo's government collapsed within weeks of Saipan's loss, as the prime minister could no longer explain how American industry sustained complex transoceanic supply chains that Japan could not interdict. The Sherman's Pacific debut set enduring patterns of American military dominance, overwhelming production, reliable machinery, and logistics that sustained far-flung operations. Combined arms tactics forged on Saipan, infantry advancing under armor, tanks smashing fortifications while foot soldiers cleared hidden threats, became doctrinal staples through the remainder of the war and influenced later conflicts. Japanese adaptations shifted toward concealed anti-tank emplacements, suicide attacks, and improvised explosives, but these changes demanded abandoning prepared positions and thus invited artillery and airstrikes. Logistical lessons reverberated through U.S. planning for the rest of the 20th century. Mass production plus global supply networks created decisive advantages that tactical ingenuity alone could not offset. In the Pacific theater, Sherman's achieved operational readiness rates above 90% through rigorous preventive maintenance and crew training, and mechanical reliability became as critical as firepower in sustained operations. Practical innovations. Born of the campaign, tank infantry field telephones for direct coordination, waterproofing and tropicalization of vehicles, modified ammunition stowage, and specialized flamethrower variants like the M4A3R3, Zippo for bunker clearing, entered the armored lexicon and influenced subsequent designs and tactics used at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Fire suppression systems were charged and ready, and crews had practiced underwater escape drills in case tanks flooded. Months of coordinated training showed in every assignment. Morrison sat on the turret's right as commander, making tactical calls and selecting targets. Corporal Johnson handled the 75mm gun and coaxial machine gun from the left. Private First Class Anthony Romano kept the ammunition flowing and aided in aiming. Driver PFC Michael O'Brien of Boston managed movement from the hull, operating, transmission and steering linkages. Assistant driver Private Thomas Anderson of Minnesota manned the hull machine gun and helped with observation and navigation. Lieutenant Colonel Goto methodically reviewed sand table models that replicated every contour of his sector. Coastal batteries were to engage approaching landing craft at maximum standoff, concentrating on the largest vessels that carried tanks and heavy gear, while beach obstacles would shepherd survivors into prearranged kill zones where anti-tank, guns and infantry could inflict maximum damage. All units confirm final readiness, his communications sergeant reported. Artillery positions fully stocked. Anti-tank crews have completed range cards for likely approaches. Observation. Posts manned and reporting normal. Goto inclined his head and privately ran the odds through his mind. Fresh intelligence suggested American tank strength far exceeded earlier estimates. Over 100 medium tanks backed by seemingly unending naval and artillery fire presented a threat beyond Japan's defenses, yet duty demanded they resist to the utmost. Japanese doctrine stressed depth and mutual support. Primary beach defenses would delay and disrupt assaults while inflicting heavy losses. Secondary inland positions would form concentrated killing zones to destroy enemy armor with concealed fire, and final defensive lines would guard vital points for last-ditch resistance. Captain Yamada inspected his dispersed tank revetments. His 34 operational vehicles were hidden along expected avenues of advance. 23 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks with 47mm guns and 11 Type 95 Hago light tanks intended for infantry support and interdiction. Speaking to his crews, he exhorted honor and reliance on terrain and fighting spirit to overcome superior enemy numbers. But the tactical truth was harsher. Japanese armor, built for speed and close infantry support against lightly equipped foes, was outmatched by Sherman's superior protection, firepower, and reliability. His crews averaged about 3 years' experience from China campaigns and were proficient in infantry support tasks, yet none had confronted medium American tanks at scale. Colonel Ikeda's anti-tank positions represented Japan's best counter, a dozen Type 1 47mm guns sited in concealed bunkers with clear fields of fire aimed at expected approaches. Effective against side or rear armor at close ranges, but marginal against Sherman frontal protection except at point-blank ranges. Extensive minefields were laid, but steel shortages forced many devices to use ceramic or concrete casings that were less dependable than metal mines. In the pre-dawn hours of June 15th, the pre-landing bombardment began, concentrating industrial naval fire on the small island. Battleships, Pennsylvania, California, Tennessee, and Maryland opened their 16-inch batteries, hurling armor-piercing projectiles, weighing thousands of pounds in a sustained thunder that shook ships and men even 15 miles offshore. Colorado rode in LST 317's flooded well deck with twin diesels idling at about 800 RPM as Sergeant Morrison watched through his periscope explosions tear the beaches into volcanic upheavals, each battleship shell carving craters some 30 feet across and 20 feet deep and tossing debris for hundreds of yards. "They're turning the whole damn island into powder," the loader muttered. But Morrison knew many concrete emplacements were engineered to survive everything short of a direct hit by the heaviest naval guns and would still be able to slaughter landing forces. Orders crackled through the LST as ballast tanks flooded and the stern dropped, admitting seawater into the tank deck. Morrison engaged Colorado's transmission and braced for the riskiest phase, while Lieutenant Bales' radio reminded crews to keep the twin diesels running until clear of the surf. If the engines died in 5 feet of water, they'd all be swimming back to California. The Sherman's General Motors 6046 twin diesels thrummed reliably, the synchronized power plants delivering 410 horsepower through controlled differential steering to tracks that could move 31 tons at roughly 26 mph on roads and 15 mph cross-country drivetrains, proven in thousands of tanks but untested in Pacific amphibious combat. Colorado eased down the ramp into about 5 feet of water. Warm seawater lapped the hull, yet the waterproofing held and the engines kept turning. Haze and bombardment smoke blurred the shoreline some 900 yards ahead, but coastal artillery that had survived the barrage now opened with deadly accuracy. 120mm shells erupted around approaching craft like enormous waterspouts, and LST-298 took a direct hit amidships, bursting into flames and destroying the 4 Shermans aboard before they could fight. Morrison pushed Colorado forward through increasingly shallow water while his driver watched engine temps and oil pressure and machine gun tracers stitched the air above assaulting infantry pinned in the surf. At the high water line, where sand met tropical vegetation, Morrison's periscope picked out the first defensive position. A reinforced concrete bunker with 4-foot-thick walls and a 75mm gun covering the beach, and Lieutenant Bales' voice ordered Colorado to knock it out so the infantry could move inland, advising he rounds for maximum effect against concrete. Morrison traversed the turret, centered the gun on the firing port at about 250 yards, and prepared for rapid fire. The key question was whether a high explosive round could breach reinforced concrete designed to shrug off naval bombardment. The Sherman's 75mm M3 fired with thunderous force, the 15-pound HE shell crossing the short distance and slamming into the port with devastating kinetic energy. The result stunned observers. The bunker, built to resist indirect ship fire, could not withstand direct hits from a tank gun at point-blank ranges. The round penetrated the port, detonated inside, killed the gun crew, and destroyed the emplacement. "We blew that thing wide open!" the loader cried over the intercom, and Morrison was already scanning for the next threat as 2 more bunkers continued to pour interlocking machine gun fire onto the beach, keeping Marines pinned until tanks eliminated those positions. The psychological impact on defenders was immediate. From his command post 600 yards inland, Lieutenant Colonel Goto watched in disbelief as coastal defenses engineered to shrug off battleship shells were being pierced by direct tank fire at ranges where accuracy was assured, and radio nets filled with alarmed reports. American heavy tanks are destroying our positions with direct fire. Coastal defense bunkers were being methodically knocked out, and urgent calls went up for anti-tank support as Goto realized his year and a half of preparations rested on fundamentally mistaken assumptions about American capabilities. Shermans were not merely infantry escorts, but mobile artillery able to pierce and demolish fortifications with pinpoint direct fire. By mid-morning, 3 more tanks from Lieutenant Bales' company, China Gal, Cecilia, and Angel, had made the Yaiji beach despite ongoing Japanese shelling, fanning out across the landing zone with their twin diesels screaming as they climbed the slope and began systematically undoing defensive works. Marines fell into the practiced teamwork they had drilled for months. Squads that had been pinned for more than an hour and a half began moving up behind the 31-ton shields of the tanks, which provided close protection against anti-tank teams, while the infantry secured flanks and stopped enemy sappers from planting magnetic mines or satchel charges. The result was force multiplication rather than simple addition. Staff Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, manning a Type 1 47mm anti-tank gun, watched the Shermans with horror. His piece could threaten Sherman side armor under about 400 yards, but these American tanks were closing head-on and presenting their thickest frontal plates. "Range 350 yards, his gunner reported, hands shaking. "Load armor piercing. Aim for the turret front. Fire when ready." The crack of the gun echoed, but the AP round glanced off Colorado's frontal armor. Morrison's crew barely noticed as they pressed forward. "Sir, our gun is useless against the frontal armor," the gunner radioed in panic, and Nakamura understood at once that a weapon designed to stop Soviet light tanks was impotent here. Resolute to do his duty despite the futility, he grabbed Type 99 magnetic mines and prepared a suicide approach to try to cripple Colorado's tracks, the last technique that might stop an American tank. Morrison, watching the jungle through his periscope, called out to his hull gunner, "Infantry in the trees, 10 o'clock, engage with the 50. Private Anderson's heavy gun spat tracer into the foliage, and Nakamura was killed before coming. Within reach, his desperate, repeated anti-tank efforts ended like many before them. By late morning, Bale's 4 operational Shermans had smashed the bunkers guarding the main landing beaches, and Marines pushed inland behind the tanks, meeting only scattered, disheartened resistance. The beachhead planners had expected to hold at least 72 hours, yet it collapsed in under 6. The tactical revolution was undeniable. Shermans had thoroughly upended Japanese defensive doctrine and established a template many future Pacific assaults would follow. The success on the sand produced immediate panic within Saipan's command. Goto received reports that seemed to defy reason. American tanks were demolishing reinforced concrete positions that should have survived everything short of direct battleship hits, and his prepared lines were failing faster than reserves could be thrown in. "All coastal defense positions in sectors 7 through 12 are silent," his communications officer reported, "and there are multiple enemy tanks moving inland toward the airfield." Goto stared at the map as the scale of the catastrophe sank in. His anti-tank placements had been arranged to stop light vehicles, not 31-ton monsters whose armor shrugged off Japanese weapons. His own tank company had been organized for infantry support, not head-to-head battles with superior enemy armor. Yet Japanese doctrine allowed no retreat or surrender. Duty demanded fighting to the death. So Goto readied his reserves for desperate counterattacks, hoping numbers and local knowledge could achieve what preparation had failed to do. For the Americans, the battlefield gains brought immediate operational headaches. Shermans were devastatingly effective, but tropical operations with continuous electrical loads pushed fuel consumption far beyond planners' estimates, threatening to outstrip supply. Lieutenant Bale quickly surveyed his company's status while keeping the pressure on. 4 tanks still combat-capable with sufficient main gun ammunition, but fuel was dwindling faster than anticipated, and machine gun belts were being burned through by constant engagements with enemy infiltrators. Bale called his lead tank. "What's your fuel situation? We've got to keep pressing before they reorganize." "About 3/4 of a tank's worth left, sir," Morrison answered, scanning with his periscope. "Maybe 4 hours at current burn." Those calculations became critical. Shermans could reduce any Japanese position, but only if fuel and ammunition held up. Pacific Logistics had to adapt on the fly. Engineers began cutting routes for fuel trucks, while pumps and jerry cans were ferried ashore under artillery fire. Portable pumps and hoses unloaded directly onto the beaches, and fuel storage points hurriedly camouflaged and shielded. The logistics tale for armored warfare was being written amid the fighting. Medical evacuation also needed tailoring for tank casualties. Extracting wounded from cramped compartments required special techniques, and recovery of disabled tanks demanded heavy gear that had not yet arrived, leaving crews to rely on organic tools and on-hand spares. By the afternoon of June 16th, Japanese plans for a counterattack laid bare the full scale of American technological and industrial dominance. Captain Yamada gathered his remaining tank crews for what everyone knew would be a near-suicidal assault on American-held positions now backed by superior armor. From 34 tanks at the start, his force had been reduced to about 30 operable vehicles after airstrikes and long-range naval gunfire had wrecked revetments. His survivors, roughly 20 Type 97 Chiha mediums and 10 Type 95 Hago lights, comprised Japan's entire armored reserve on Saipan. The disparity was brutal on paper and crushing to morale. Sherman's 75mm guns could pierce Japanese armor well beyond 1,000 yards, while the Chiha's 47mm lacked the power to breach Sherman frontal protection at any practical range. This was not a contest of equals, but a mechanical mismatch in which inferior equipment faced superior weapons. Still, Yamada addressed his men with solemn resolve. "We attack at dawn to drive the invaders into the sea. Their tanks are strong and many, but our fighting spirit and willingness to sacrifice will bring victory for the Emperor." The rhetoric could not hide the truth his experienced commanders already knew. Japanese armor doctrine, built for speed and maneuver against Chinese forces or for close infantry support, was unsuited to fight American Shermans with better protection, firepower, crew training, and reliability. Annihilation loomed. American signals intelligence had intercepted Japanese radio traffic, planning the attack, giving Lieutenant Bale advanced warning and the grim satisfaction of preparedness. He ordered over the company net that an enemy armor assault was expected before dawn to load armor-piercing rounds and hold defensive positions, covering the airfield approaches, exactly the scenario they had trained for during their long preparation. The psychological effect across Saipan's forces deepened. Soldiers who had been told their fortifications were impregnable watched concrete emplacements collapse under tank fire, leaving traditional notions of valor and stubborn resistance tragically irrelevant against the cold arithmetic of technological superiority. These purpose-built machines were technological adaptations that gave American forces decisive tools against fortified positions. And although the Battle of Saipan dragged on for 25 days, with roughly 46,000 military casualties and thousands of civilian deaths, its strategic fate was effectively sealed in the opening 6 hours when Sherman tanks methodically shredded coastal defenses that had taken 18 months to build. Those 31-ton beasts rolling ashore represented far more than weapons. They embodied American industrial output, the capacity to project overwhelming power across oceans in a way no other nation could match, and Japanese defenders watched supposedly indestructible concrete bunkers collapse under precise 75mm fire, proving that individual valor, however ancient and revered, could not by itself withstand mechanized mass production. Lieutenant Colonel Guto died in his command bunker on July 9th as organized resistance disintegrated, and his last radio to Tokyo warned bluntly that American industrial capacity outpaced Japan's ability to counter with traditional military methods and urged an immediate shift to a defensive doctrine grounded in technological reality rather than mere fighting spirit. Sergeant Morrison survived the war and returned to Detroit to work again in the auto factories that had produced his tank. He rarely spoke of combat but kept detailed photos of Colorado breaching Japanese fortifications and later told his children that those tanks embodied everything that set America apart. The consequences extended far beyond Saipan. Captured airfields allowed B-29 superfortresses to strike the home islands, launching the most destructive strategic bombing campaign in Aish history and culminating in the atomic strikes that forced Japan's surrender. The August 15, 1945 announcement by Emperor Hirohito specifically referenced a new and most cruel bomb. But those weapons were the climax of a technological superiority first demonstrated on Saipan's beaches some 15 months earlier. Japan simply could not match the industrial ability to ship heavy armor thousands of miles while sustaining complex supply chains of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Captain Yamada's doomed attack and the sacrifice of his tank crews illustrated the human cost when traditional martial virtues met industrial age warfare. Crews who advanced knowing their tanks were outmatched did so out of duty, and their losses removed Saipan's only mobile counterattack reserve. The Sherman's performance on Saipan proved that modern war had become fundamentally industrial. Manufacturing, transportation, and logistics now shaped battlefield outcomes more decisively than courage, training, or tactical finesse alone. Although technology did not erase human factors, it created advantages individual excellence could not overcome. That moral tension troubled many American veterans afterward. Lieutenant Bale later wrote that he respected the extraordinary courage of Japanese soldiers who fought with inadequate equipment. But he also recognized that industrial capacity, not individual heroism, decided the campaign. When Allied occupation forces arrived in Japan in September 1945, they employed many of the same Sherman tanks that had first demonstrated American armored dominance at Saipan, and the vehicle's mechanical dependability, tropical adaptations, and logistical support that had sustained operations across thousands of miles remained a model for subsequent conflicts. The decisive combination of reliable engines, effective 75mm firepower, mass production, and global sustainment established an era of American technological dominance in warfare, shaping doctrine, equipment design, and logistics for decades. This narrative is based on extensive research using primary sources, official histories, and verified technical documentation. While the major events, unit identifications, and strategic conclusions are presented accurately, some dialogue and individual crew details have been dramatized to illustrate the broader historical reality of Sherman operations.